The forest had a voice, a low murmur that wound around the hills like smoke, and it had been calling the sisters long before anyone noticed they were gone. On the edge of the Appalachian wilderness, the town whispered of shadows moving where light never touched, but no one dared venture too far, except the sisters, drawn by a restless curiosity that would become their undoing. The air thickened as they stepped into the underbrush, the kind of silence that pressed against the chest and made hearts pound with uneasy anticipation. Days later, the first rumors reached the town, glimpses of flickering candlelight deep in the trees, the echo of strange, guttural noises, and a figure so wild it seemed not quite human. They found it first, the men who lived among the trees, his skin weathered like bark, his eyes dark pools that held both madness and knowledge. He moved with a predator's ease, and yet there was an unsettling patience in the way he watched them, measuring, waiting. The sisters, trapped by tangled roots in the relentless expanse of wilderness, began to understand the forest's cruel logic. Escape was not merely difficult, it was impossible. Nights in the cabin were longer than any they had known, filled with whispered incantations, symbols carved into walls, and a creeping awareness that the forest itself seemed complicit, bending to the will of its feral master. And then the truth arrived in silence, a quiet horror that did not scream but settled deep into their bones. The sisters were no longer merely captives, they were changed, their bodies betraying them in the most intimate, terrifying way. With every step into the shadows, every whispered word from the dark corners of the cabin, the reality crystallized, the men, the forest, the silence, all of it conspired to rewrite their lives in a way that the outside world could never imagine. Somewhere beyond the trees, distant voices murmured, carrying the faintest hint of rescue, but as the sisters lay awake under the oppressive night, it became clear that survival demanded a reckoning with a darkness far older and more cunning than anyone could see, and the forest would not let them leave without leaving a piece of themselves behind. The sisters' disappearance began with an ordinary day that quickly turned into an unsettling mystery, one that would haunt the small Appalachian town for years to come. Locals still recall seeing them near the edge of the forest, two figures moving with a carefree curiosity that belied the danger waiting within the dense woodland. The trees there were ancient and tangled, their roots like skeletal fingers curling across the forest floor, and a thick canopy blocked the sun, casting perpetual shadows even at midday. What began as a simple stroll to explore the wilderness soon became the first thread in a web of fear and suspicion. The sisters were known for their adventurous spirit, often wandering farther than most dared, but this time, something felt different, an invisible tension clinging to the air, a whisper of something unseen observing their every move. The townspeople spoke in hushed tones of the forest's reputation, of strange noises that echoed at night and lights that flickered among the trees without explanation. Some dismissed these stories as old wives' tales, yet the forest seemed to breathe with a life of its own, ready to consume those who dared step too deeply into its shadows. As the sisters ventured deeper, the familiar landmarks of their world faded, replaced by the oppressive and alien environment of the Appalachian wilderness. The further they went, the more the forest seemed to shift around them, as though it were aware of their presence, guiding them toward an unknown fate. Small animals scurried away at the sound of their footsteps, and the wind carried echoes that were almost human, whispering through the branches in a way that made their skin crawl. Each step took them farther from safety and deeper into isolation, and the sisters began to sense the subtle changes in the atmosphere, the way the trees leaned closer as if to listen, the strange smells that had no origin, and the quiet hum of a place that existed outside normal understanding. It was as though the forest itself had a memory, holding secrets and watching intruders with a patience that was both unnerving and deliberate. Back in town, concern grew as evening descended and the sisters did not return. Neighbors organized small search parties, calling out their names and scanning the forest edge, but the shadows swallowed their voices. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig heightened the sense of dread, and the first whispers began to spread of something lurking beyond the familiar paths, something feral and watchful. By the time the first hints of fear settled into the hearts of those who knew the sisters best, it was already clear that this was not a simple wandering gone awry. The forest had claimed its victims, and the air itself seemed to murmur of a presence that would not let them leave, setting the stage for the horrors that would unfold in the days and nights to come. The discovery of the cabin was the moment the town's fears began to take shape, transforming vague unease into a tangible, almost suffocating dread. Hidden deep within the Appalachian forest, it was a structure that seemed to have grown from the earth itself, its weathered timbers blending seamlessly with the surrounding trees and underbrush. Thick moss climbed the walls, and the roof sagged under years of neglect, yet signs of recent habitation were unmistakable, fresh footprints in the mud, faint smoke curling from a crooked chimney, and the unmistakable smell of cooking that lingered in the damp air. The cabin's very existence suggested a deliberate concealment, a place so far removed from civilization that it had remained invisible to anyone who had not been specifically led there. As those who had dared approach the edge of the woods pressed forward, a creeping sense of unease took hold, a feeling that the forest itself had been guarding this secret and that something inside waited, patient and aware, for intruders to arrive. Every detail of the cabin whispered of isolation and secrecy. The windows were dark, their panes dusty and cracked, and the door, though crudely hung, bore fresh scratch marks, as if warning anyone who approached to turn back. The forest around it seemed unnaturally quiet, the usual rustle of leaves and chirp of birds subdued, as though the wilderness itself had learned to hold its breath. Stepping closer, the air grew heavy and humid, carrying a faint metallic tang that hinted at human activity, though of a kind that felt wrong, foreign, and dangerous. Inside, the space was dim and cluttered, filled with the remnants of lives lived apart from society, makeshift furniture, tools worn by constant use, and signs of food and water carefully tended. Yet it was not simply the presence of human life that unsettled those who glimpsed it, but the deliberate arrangement, the sense that every object had been placed with intention, as if part of a ritual or plan that outsiders could not begin to understand. It was impossible to ignore the aura of menace that clung to the cabin. Shadows stretched unnaturally in the corners, and every floorboard groaned underfoot as though protesting intrusion. The deeper one looked, the more details emerged that defied easy explanation: markings on the walls, symbols etched into wood and stone, the remnants of fires in carefully dug pits. The forest, once merely a backdrop for the sisters' disappearance, had become a participant in the unfolding horror, concealing and protecting its inhabitant with the cunning patience of something alive and sentient. Those who had ventured close felt eyes upon them, though no one was there, and a shiver ran through them at the realization that this cabin was more than a simple hideaway. It was the threshold to something terrifying, a threshold beyond which normal rules did not apply and where the sisters' fate had already begun to take shape in ways the town could scarcely imagine. The encounter with the feral man marked the turning point where fear shifted from rumor into undeniable reality, a moment so charged with terror that it would linger in the memories of those who would later hear the story. The first glimpse came almost without warning, a shadow among the trees, unnervingly still, yet radiating a presence that seemed to absorb light itself. He was immense, his frame towering and wiry, muscles coiled like the forest itself had carved him from its own twisted wood. His hair was long, tangled, and matted with the residue of years spent untamed in the wilderness, while his skin, weathered and sun-darkened, bore the marks of a life spent in isolation, etched with scars and the crude remnants of previous confrontations. His eyes, the most unnerving feature, were dark and reflective, holding a feral intelligence and a predatory patience that made it clear he had long studied the rhythms of the forest and those who dared enter it. The sisters froze at the edge of the clearing, hearts hammering, the forest around them seemingly silent in reverence, or perhaps fear, of the figure before them. Every instinct screamed to flee, but the dense underbrush and unfamiliar terrain held them in a tense paralysis. The man's movements were deliberate and unsettling. He stepped lightly, almost noiselessly, and yet every motion was imbued with a latent threat. There was a strange magnetism to him, a compelling pull that was both repulsive and hypnotic, as though the forest itself had lent him an aura designed to ensnare the unwary. He observed the sisters with a measured calm, his head tilting ever so slightly as if cataloguing their strength, their fears, and their vulnerabilities. Even without a word spoken, he communicated dominance, the kind that made it painfully clear that escape would not come through conventional means. The initial moments were a tense standoff, the sisters' fear matched only by the unnatural stillness of the forest, which seemed to lean in, eavesdropping on the encounter. Any sudden movement could provoke a response, and the sisters quickly learned that the man's calm was as dangerous as his strength. He carried an aura of the wild, of someone who existed outside the bounds of society and law, untouched by its morals or constraints. It became evident that his survival depended on a deep understanding of the forest, and that knowledge made him not merely a threat but a predator in the truest sense, one whose patience could outlast any hesitation, whose cunning could outwit any plan. In that moment, the sisters realized the horrifying truth: they were not dealing with an ordinary hermit or a fleeting danger, but a force of nature incarnate, a human shaped by the forest to be both hunter and warden. The air itself seemed to tighten around them, charged with anticipation, as if the trees and shadows themselves had conspired to trap them. The encounter left no room for doubt, only a mounting terror that the forest had delivered them into the hands of something utterly inhuman, and that the fragile line between predator and prey had already been drawn. The sisters' isolation and the gradual tightening of the forest's grip became a suffocating reality, transforming their initial fear into a profound sense of helplessness. At first, they had thought the wilderness was merely unfamiliar, a challenge to navigate, but the forest quickly revealed itself as a cunning, relentless force. Every attempt to retrace their steps was thwarted by the labyrinth of undergrowth and the twisting paths that seemed to shift underfoot, erasing any landmarks they might have recognized. The terrain itself became a cage, each slope, root, and ravine conspiring to slow their progress and funnel them deeper into the heart of the woods. Even the air felt different here, thicker, heavier, carrying a faint metallic tang that unsettled them and hinted at human presence beyond the trees, though they could not yet see it. The sisters began to understand that the forest was not simply a backdrop for danger, it was a participant, silently observing, waiting, and guiding them toward a fate that seemed preordained. Inside the cabin, the sense of control wielded by the feral man grew ever more oppressive. He moved with quiet precision, ensuring that the sisters could never feel entirely safe. Every window was watched, every door a potential point of entry for the unknown. He dictated the rhythm of their days, limiting movement, controlling access to food and water, and monitoring their interactions with one another. The sisters' sense of time blurred, days and nights bled together as the monotony of captivity and the oppressive weight of the forest pressed in from all sides. Even moments of relative calm carried an underlying tension, a quiet reminder that their environment itself had become an instrument of domination. It was a place where every shadow seemed alive, every sound amplified, and where the instinct to flee was countered by the ever-present knowledge that the forest and its inhabitant were one, working against them in perfect concert. As their isolation deepened, the sisters began to notice the subtler ways in which the forest shaped their captivity. Small paths appeared where none had existed, guiding them toward the cabin and cutting off any potential escape. The man's knowledge of the terrain was absolute, he could appear at the edge of vision without sound, track movement with uncanny precision, and anticipate the sisters' reactions before they even acted. Fear became a constant companion, and with it, a creeping realization that the forest itself was an ally to their captor, a silent predator that would not allow them to leave unscathed. Each night in the cabin brought new awareness of their vulnerability, the stillness of the woods pressing against the walls, the unbroken dark hiding countless eyes and ears. The sisters' hope waned with each passing day, replaced by a gnawing understanding that their isolation was complete, and that survival would demand confronting forces far beyond anything they had ever imagined, both human and something older, something primal, hidden in the dark heart of the forest. The forest around the cabin seemed to pulse with a life of its own, and the sisters soon realized that the feral man's behaviors were far from ordinary. At first, it was subtle, strange movements at dusk, the occasional placement of objects in odd patterns, and a peculiar attention to the natural rhythms of the forest. But as days passed, his actions took on a ritualistic quality that was impossible to ignore. He would carve crude symbols into tree trunks, each stroke deliberate, as though the marks themselves held power or communicated a message only he could decipher. Some were simple lines or crosses, while others were more intricate, resembling twisted human forms or distorted faces, their meaning entirely opaque to the sisters. These carvings appeared overnight, and no matter how closely the sisters watched, they could never catch him in the act, suggesting a patience and cunning honed over years of solitary living. The forest seemed to aid him, providing cover, masking sounds, and directing intruders' attention away from his work, as if the land itself were an accomplice in his dark designs. Inside the cabin, the rituals were even more disturbing. The men arranged objects in precise patterns, leaving food, stones, and other natural items in sequences that hinted at a method or purpose beyond comprehension. The sisters noticed the way he performed repetitive motions during certain hours, speaking in low murmurs, sometimes to himself, sometimes to the shadows. At night, he moved silently through the cabin, his hands brushing along the walls, his eyes scanning each corner with meticulous care. Candles burned at irregular intervals, and small fires were tended in pits dug deep into the cabin floor. Each of these acts was imbued with an eerie rhythm, and the sisters began to sense that they were not merely captive observers, they were unwitting participants in a carefully controlled environment, one that had been shaped to enforce fear and dependence. The psychological weight of these rituals became increasingly suffocating. The sisters could feel the forest's influence in every sound and movement around them, the snap of a branch, the rustle of leaves, the distant cries of unseen creatures. It became clear that the man's actions were a way of asserting dominance, a constant reminder of his presence and control, blending the natural world with his own twisted rules. Every symbol carved, every object arranged, every whispered word in the dark reinforced their helplessness. The cabin, already a prison, became a stage for acts that were both terrifying and mesmerizing, leaving the sisters with the growing realization that they were trapped not only by physical barriers but by an almost supernatural orchestration of fear. The forest and the men together created a rhythm that was impossible to resist, a relentless, omnipresent force that would shape every thought, every fear, and every hope they had, bending the world itself to the feral man's incomprehensible will. The realization of pregnancy struck the sisters with a horror that was both intimate and incomprehensible, a creeping awareness that transformed their captivity into a nightmare of bodily violation and helplessness. At first, the changes were subtle: fatigue that could not be explained, nausea that came in waves, and the quiet, unrelenting understanding that their bodies were no longer solely their own. The cabin, already oppressive with the presence of the feral man and the forest that seemed to watch their every move, became a chamber of dread, each corner filled with the looming reminder of what had been done. The sisters shared glances, once full of curiosity and mischief, now carried a silent terror, a recognition that their fate had been rewritten in the most intimate and devastating way imaginable. There was no escape from this reality: the forest, the cabin, and the men had conspired to trap them physically, mentally, and now biologically, creating a terror that was deeply personal and impossible to ignore. The physical changes were accompanied by an overwhelming psychological weight. Every movement reminded them of their vulnerability, every interaction with the men reinforced the loss of autonomy. The forest outside, which had once seemed simply menacing, now loomed as a silent witness, its shadows hiding secrets they could scarcely name. Even the simplest acts of daily survival, finding water, enduring the sparse food rations, navigating the confined space of the cabin, became infused with a tension born of this new, inescapable reality. The sisters began to understand the full extent of the man's control. He had not only ensnared them in the wilderness but had imposed a biological dominance that would have lasting consequences, a cruel mark of his power that extended beyond mere confinement. Their awareness of the pregnancies brought with it a mixture of horror and despair, a gnawing recognition that they were utterly isolated in their suffering. They could see no path to liberation that did not involve unimaginable risk, and the forest, with its endless corridors of trees and shadows, offered no solace. Every sound, an animal moving through undergrowth, the rustle of branches in the wind, the faint murmur of distant water, became a reminder that escape was nearly impossible, that the men knew this land as thoroughly as he knew them. Even as the sisters clung to each other for comfort, the knowledge of what had been inflicted upon them created an invisible barrier between hope and reality, a psychological prison as real and suffocating as the cabin itself. The cabin's walls, the forest's canopy, and the man's looming presence combined to enforce a relentless pressure, a constant reminder of their altered bodies and their powerlessness. The realization that the pregnancies were irreversible, that their lives had been reshaped by the feral man's deliberate design, introduced a terror unlike any they had experienced before, one that would dominate their thoughts and fears, embedding itself in every heartbeat and every shadow in the oppressive wilderness that now held them captive. As night fell over the forest, the cabin seemed to transform into a place where reality and something darker intertwined, and the sisters began to hear the whispers. At first, they thought it was the wind moving through the branches, the gentle rustle of leaves against the cabin walls, or the scurrying of small creatures in the underbrush. But the sounds were different, deliberate, almost articulate, sometimes faintly human, other times impossible to identify. They floated through the shadows like half-formed sentences, rising and falling in pitch and tone, sometimes close enough to make the sisters' skin crawl, yet vanishing when they strained to locate the source. The voices carried a strange familiarity, a subtle echo of the sisters' own thoughts and fears, and in the dead of night, the boundary between imagination and reality began to blur. It became impossible to tell whether the whispers were warnings, taunts, or the forest itself communicating a sinister intelligence that had long gone unnoticed by those who wandered its depths. The sisters could no longer rest. Each night was filled with a tense vigilance, ears straining for the slightest variation in the whispers, hearts pounding in anticipation of the unknown. Sometimes, the sounds seemed to form words, pleas, murmurs, or fragmented phrases that suggested others had been here before them, victims of the same forest-bound terror. Shadows shifted against the walls of the cabin, and the faint outlines of shapes moving outside reinforced the sense that the woods were not empty, that the forest itself had become a living participant in their imprisonment. Even in moments of silence, the sisters felt an oppressive presence, as if unseen eyes were watching them from every dark corner, measuring every heartbeat and movement, confirming their vulnerability and the depth of their isolation. The whispers grew more intense as the days passed, appearing at times during the day as faint echoes in the corners of their minds. They seemed to respond to the sisters' fears, rising in pitch and volume when panic or despair took hold, receding when they attempted to calm themselves. This constant auditory assault eroded the sisters' sense of security, leaving them in a near-perpetual state of anxiety and hyper-awareness. The forest, once merely a backdrop to their captivity, became an active force, shaping the sisters' experience and reinforcing the control of the feral man. They realized that they were never alone, that the whispers were reminders of the unseen boundaries that trapped them and the ever-present dangers lurking just beyond the walls of the cabin. The auditory hallucinations, or perhaps something more real, forced the sisters to question everything they perceived. Every crack of a branch, every flutter of shadow, every shifting gust of wind became a potential messenger of terror. The constant presence of the voices blurred the lines between the forest, the men, and the sisters' own minds, creating a psychological prison as confining as the cabin itself. In this way, the whispers in the dark became a mechanism of control, a reminder that the forest, the men, and the unseen forces that lingered just beyond understanding were watching, shaping, and manipulating their every thought and action, leaving the sisters trapped not only physically but mentally in a world where nothing could be trusted. Back in the town, unease had begun to ripple through the community as the sisters' absence stretched beyond a single night. Friends, neighbors, and distant relatives whispered in hushed tones, their conversations laced with fear and speculation. Small search parties formed, but the forest seemed to swallow every attempt at pursuit, its dense underbrush, gnarled roots, and steep inclines creating a labyrinth no outsider could easily navigate. Locals who had ventured even to the forest's edge reported hearing strange sounds, low growls, the snap of twigs underfoot, and sometimes voices that carried faintly on the wind. There were glimpses of movement, fleeting shadows between the trees, and signs of disturbance in the soil and foliage that suggested the presence of something or someone deliberately hiding in the wilderness. Panic mingled with curiosity, and the line between bravery and recklessness grew thin as townspeople debated whether to push deeper into the forest or leave the matter to fate. Hunters and trackers arrived, armed with knowledge of the terrain and a determination born of fear, yet even they found the forest disorienting and uncooperative. Trails disappeared, familiar landmarks shifted, and the sounds of pursuit seemed to echo back from unexpected directions. It was as if the woods themselves were aware of intruders, bending paths and masking evidence, guiding outsiders away from the cabin where the sisters remained hidden. Those who ventured too close spoke afterward of a strange sensation, an unshakable feeling of being watched, of something larger than a human presence tracking their movements. Their stories, fragmented and inconsistent, only heightened the town's anxiety, creating a mythic sense of the forest as an active, sentient force that protected its secrets with an almost supernatural vigilance. Rumors began to spread of a monstrous man, a feral figure who lived within the forest and exercised dominion over its shadows. Some claimed to have seen him, glimpsed a massive frame moving with unnatural grace, eyes glinting from the underbrush, or heard his guttural calls echoing through the hills. These accounts, combined with the disappearance of the sisters, turned concern into terror. Families locked doors earlier, parents forbade children from wandering near the forest, and a pervasive unease settled over the town, as if the trees themselves carried the weight of the threat. Despite the efforts of the townspeople, every search ended with frustration and fear. The forest swallowed the sisters and their captor in equal measure, concealing the cabin and every trace of its horrifying reality. The sense of dread grew because it became clear that this was no ordinary disappearance. Something in the forest, human, animal, or something older, was orchestrating events with meticulous precision. The townspeople's hope for rescue diminished as each day passed, replaced by the chilling understanding that the sisters' fate was intertwined with the feral man and the unyielding wilderness, and that whatever horror awaited them in the cabin remained hidden, controlled, and entirely beyond human reach, leaving the forest and its secrets to dominate every whispered thought in the town below. The sisters' growing awareness of the danger surrounding them forced them toward a grim choice, a harrowing calculation between survival and escape that weighed every thought and movement. The cabin, which had once felt like mere confinement, had become a stage for the man's control, a place where every object, every shadow, and every ritual reinforced his dominance. Yet as days stretched into weeks, an instinctive determination began to take hold in the sisters, a quiet, almost desperate awareness that they could not endure indefinite captivity. The forest outside, once an unknowable expanse, had revealed itself in small ways, the gentle patterns of wind, the hidden paths animals took, and subtle openings between the trees that might offer a chance, however slim, to flee. It was a dangerous calculus. Each step toward freedom risked immediate discovery, punishment, or death, but remaining in the cabin guaranteed ongoing suffering and the erosion of their autonomy. The feral man's vigilance was constant and calculated. He seemed to anticipate their every thought, appearing suddenly in shadows, moving silently through the underbrush, and demonstrating a level of control that made the forest itself seem like an extension of his will. Even small attempts at defiance were met with subtle, terrifying consequences. The rearrangement of the cabin's interior, sudden changes in routine, or a menacing presence just beyond the sisters' vision. These experiences drilled into them the lesson that any escape would require cunning, patience, and an understanding of the forest as an ally rather than an obstacle. The sisters began to observe carefully, learning the rhythms of their captor, noting the moments when his attention was divided, and reading the patterns of the natural world around them, seeking the faintest advantage that might turn the tide in their favor. The decision to act brought with it an overwhelming tension, the kind that pressed down on the chest and quickened the pulse with every thought. The sisters weighed the risk of immediate flight against the possibility of long-term endurance, all while grappling with the lingering horror of what had been done to them. Each whispered plan, each cautious step toward preparation, carried the weight of life or death, amplified by the ever-present knowledge that the forest concealed both opportunity and threat. The wilderness, which had first seemed hostile, now offered clues, secret passages, and faint signs of guidance, but every element was double-edged, capable of betraying as easily as it might aid. As the moment of choice approached, the sisters' internal struggle intensified, a mixture of fear, courage, and grim determination that sharpened their senses and forced them to confront both the feral man and the environment that had enabled his control. Survival depended not only on physical cunning but on psychological resilience, on the ability to anticipate danger and act with precision. Every heartbeat carried the weight of possibility, and every shadow in the darkened forest loomed with potential consequence, leaving the sisters on the precipice of action, aware that any misstep could seal their fate forever, yet knowing that inaction guaranteed a different kind of horror, one that was just as real and unrelenting.